Hello, class. I have a question for you. How do you convince someone that something feels good? One way, of course, is to have them try it themselves, and once they experience it, they'll know that it feels good firsthand. But what if they're not willing to try it, or they can't try it? How do you convince them then? Show that according to all the experts and according to the best testimony, it feels good. That's another way to argue that something feels good, is to show that all of the people who are best at arguing about that sort of thing agree that it feels good. And I suppose a third way to try to convince someone that something feels good is maybe you have an analysis of what it is to feel good, and you're ready to apply that analysis to the thing in question, and just show as a matter of factual measurement that it has the thing that makes for feeling good. That's the third way that you might try to do it. Hey everyone, Dr. Bauer's Office Hours here. Why am I asking about that? In a way, it's what Plato is asking about in the section of Republic Book 9 that we're going to talk about today. If the arguments brought out through Socrates and Glaucon's discussions so far in the Republic are correct, if Plato so far is right, then the person who has an honest and fair character is able to live their life without worry about chronic weakness of the will. They're able to really do what they want. They're able to pull themselves out of any bad habits they might fall into, and they're able to follow through in longer-term goals. They won't be tormented by chronic weakness of the will. In addition, they will be able to fully live and fully, truly enjoy the pleasure of contemplation, which is the pleasure associated with the soul's rational part. We also left off with this question. What should Plato say to a detractor who claims the following? Yes, I know that if I devote myself to partying, or if I devote myself to fame, that I'm going to suffer from weakness of the will. I won't have complete control over myself or my life, but you know what? It's worth it. The pleasure of appetite or the pleasure of spirit is just that much more pleasant. I just like it so much, it's worth it not having this whole free from weakness of will thing that you're so obsessed with, Mr. Plato. What should Plato say to that detractor? And I suggested that what Plato will need is some argument concerning pleasure, and that's what we're going to look at today. As we cover this section of Book 9, it's worth to keep the following study guide questions in mind, and you might want to fill them out as you're watching this video. First, which puzzle about pleasure arises in Republic 9, 581d? Second, in Republic Book 9, what is Socrates' first argument for claiming that the contemplative life is the most pleasant? And here's a hint. We're going to call this first argument the argument from experience. Third, what might be wrong with this first argument? Fourth, in Republic 9, what is Socrates' second argument for claiming that the contemplative life is the most pleasant? And this argument, as a hint, we're going to call it the argument from arguments. That's a silly name, I know, but we're going to call it that, and you'll see why once we get there. Fifth, what might be wrong with this second argument? Sixth, how does Plato analyze desire in Republic 9, and with it, pleasure? Seventh, what, according to Plato, is a truer filling? 8. In Republic 9, what is Socrates' third argument for claiming that the contemplative life is the most pleasant? And we're going to call this one the Metaphysical Argument. Ninth, and finally, present 3 objections to this third argument. Present 3 objections to the Metaphysical Argument. To start off, we begin with a puzzle. Specifically, a puzzle about which life is most pleasant. This occurs in Republic Book 9, around 581d. There are 3 kinds of lives you could live. You could live your life as an appetitively sold person and devote yourself to the pleasures of appetite, which you will enjoy more than the other pleasures. You could be a spiritedly sold person and devote yourself to the pleasures of spirit and enjoy those more than any other pleasures. Or you could be a rationally sold person and devote yourself overall to the pleasures of the rational part of the soul and find them more pleasant than any other pleasures. Which psychic part rules your soul will affect which thing you find the most pleasant. The person who is ruled by the spirited part of their soul thinks that fame is the most pleasant, and the person who's ruled by the appetitive part of their soul thinks that money and partying is most pleasant. They each think that one of the things is the most pleasant and not the other, but who's right about it? Socrates and Glaucon wonder which life is the most pleasant, and they immediately run into a puzzle. The puzzle is this. You realize then, says Socrates, that if you chose to ask each of these three types of people in turn to tell you which of their lives is most pleasant, each would give the highest praise to his own. Won't the moneymaker say that, compared to that of making a profit, the pleasures of being honored or of learning are worthless, unless there's something in it that makes them money? And what about the honor lover? Doesn't he think the pleasure of making money is vulgar, while the pleasure of learning, except to the extent that it brings honor, is smoke and nonsense? As for the philosopher, what do you suppose he thinks of the other pleasures in comparison to that of knowing where the truth lies, and always enjoying some variety of it while he is learning? Won't he think they are far behind? And won't he call them really necessary, since he would have no need for them if they were not necessary in life? So here's the puzzle. You want to know what type of life you should live. You want to live the most pleasant one, obviously. You want to make sure that you get plenty of pleasure in your life, the most if possible. So which way should you live? Should you devote yourself towards making money and enjoying it with food, drink, sex, and getting more money? Should you really devote yourself towards being remembered and being known and get your name out there and having lots of friends? Or should you devote yourself towards doing what you think is good overall and just taking some time to sit back and think about that, the truth, and doing what you ought to? What should you devote your life to when it comes to pleasure? What would give you the most pleasure? The life of the partier, the life of the socialite, or the life of the philosopher? And the puzzle is that you cannot answer this question by asking the people who live these lives. The reason why is that each person is going to claim that their own life is the most pleasant. The person who makes lots and lots of money and who lives for doing that and who gets to party a lot and enjoy fineries, that person, they're going to think about the pleasures of fame and think about the pleasures of knowledge, and they're going to rate them as pale in comparison to the pleasures of making money. You've probably encountered some people like this in your life, where it's not just that they need money to live, but it's inconceivable to them that there should be something that's good that doesn't involve spending some money or making it. By contrast, the person who really wants to be famous and who enjoys being famous more than anything, who's willing to sacrifice any amount of money in order to stay famous, that person, they're going to say that the most pleasant life is a life that's full of fame, and that you could live a life that's full of money, or you could live a life that's full of understanding and knowledge, but those won't be nearly as pleasant as actually being famous. After all, what's the good of money if you can't be famous with it? And what's the good of knowing stuff if nobody is aware that you know all that stuff and celebrates you for knowing the stuff? That's how the socialite thinks, the person who's ruled by the spirited part of the soul. And likewise for the person who most of all takes pleasure in contemplating, in thinking about deep things to the extent that they're able to, and wondering what life is all about. The person who takes the most pleasure in that is going to see that as most important. And when it comes to the pleasure of partying or the pleasure of being popular, they're going to say it's fleeting. They're going to say, yeah, you need friends, you need to enjoy yourself in the bodily ways, to stay healthy. But that's not what life is all about. Life is about, really getting the profound issues of why you're alive to begin with, right? That's the way that someone who's ruled by reason thinks, and that's why, according to Plato, they're going to describe the other pleasures as really necessary. So again, the puzzle is this. how can we know which life is pleasant, given that each life rates itself as the most pleasant? Given that you can't find out by asking people, how do you know which life is the most pleasant? You can't ask the people who live it, so what else can you do? That's the puzzle. Now, at this point, Socrates gives 3 arguments for why the life of the rationally souled person, the life of the philosopher, the contemplative life, is the most pleasant. He gives 3 arguments, and he gives them in the order of their plausibility or their evidentiary strength, or at least that's how he describes it. So he gives a little one first, a more convincing one second, and then the third one he gives a sort of drum roll to by saying he's toasting to Olympian Zeus, and it's the final overthrow of anyone who disagrees. So we're going to proceed in that order, not just because it's in the text, but it's also kind of dramatically interesting. The first argument goes like this. At 582a5, Socrates asks, how should we judge things if we want to judge them well? Isn't it by experience, knowledge, and argument? And Glaucon agrees. Consider then, he continues, of the 3 types of people, which has the most experience of the pleasures we mentioned? Do you think the prophet lover learns what the truth itself is like, or has more experience of the pleasure of knowing than the philosopher does of making a profit? Glaucon says there's a big difference between them. He says the latter, meaning the prophet lover, the person whose soul is ruled by appetite, has to have tasted the other kinds of pleasure beginning from childhood. But it is not necessary for the prophet lover to taste or experience how sweet is the pleasure of learning the nature of the things that are, and even if he were eager to, he could not easily do so. So he's saying this, that as we grow up in life, we all experience certain kinds of pleasures. We all have to, at some point, experience the pleasures of food, and the pleasures of intoxication, sex, and money are always close at hand. Those are natural for people to experience as they grow up in life, and likewise for the pleasures of friendship and popularity. Right? Those are common pleasures. Those are pleasures where it's hard not to have a taste of them as you go through life. But what about the pleasure of contemplating what life is all about? Or sitting back and contemplating the importance of doing what you ought? Sitting back and being able to rest easy knowing that what you have done is good and honest. What about that pleasure? Is that a pleasure that everyone just naturally encounters all throughout their life, the pleasure of contemplation? Well, no, thinks Glaucon. So what follows from this? That the philosopher has tried all 3 pleasures. He's tried the pleasures of appetite, the pleasures of the spirit, and the pleasures of the rational part of the soul, whereas the other psychic types and the other types of lives do not have to have tried the pleasures of the rational part of the soul. That means that overall, the life that involves contemplation has more knowledge of all of the kinds of pleasures. That makes it more trustworthy, which in turn means that its conclusion about which life is most pleasant is most warranted. Let's put this in a more precise structure. The argument goes like this. First, only the contemplative life includes knowledge of all 3 pleasures. Second, if only the contemplative life includes knowledge of all 3 pleasures, then we should ultimately trust the people who live contemplative lives when asking about pleasure. 3. So, we should ultimately trust the people who live contemplative lives when asking about pleasure. 4. The people who live contemplative lives claim that the contemplative life is the most pleasant. 5. If the people who live contemplative lives claim that the contemplative life is most pleasant, and if we should ultimately trust those people on such matters, then the contemplative life is the most pleasant. 6. So the contemplative life is the most pleasant. The basic idea is that the person you should trust the most is the person who's tried everything. And when you're looking at the buffet of life and you're wondering which dish you should go with, you should most trust the opinion of someone who's sampled all of the things. And of those people, only the philosopher has sampled all of the things. Only the philosopher has tried or sampled the pleasure of being good and honest and thinking about it. in addition to the pleasures of fame and friendship and the pleasures of food, drink, sex, and the money with which to get them. So you should trust that person. And what do they say is the most pleasant? Well, of course, they enjoy the pleasures of the rational part of the soul the most, because that's what they're ruled by. So, that's what you should go with. You should accept that the rational life, the contemplative life, is the most pleasant life. That's Socrates' first argument for thinking that the contemplative life is most pleasant. What might be wrong with this first argument that appeals to experience? There's a couple of basic things. One is that it assumes that casual acquaintance with appetitive and spirited pleasures is enough to know them. It assumes, in other words, that because the rationally sold person has tried the pleasures of appetite, and because they have tried the pleasures of spirit, that they know the pleasures of appetite and spirit, that they have knowledge of them, that they have experience of them. But you might doubt that. Consider the phenomenon of connoisseurship. Consider what it is to become an expert in food. If connoisseurship is a real thing, then we might doubt whether the kind of acquaintance one naturally has just by living is enough to really have knowledge of appetitive or spirited pleasures. What if knowledge required the acquisition of a refined taste? And in order to get that refined taste and really know how pleasurable something is, you needed to spend lifelong doing it. If that were true, then the rationally sold person would not be more knowledgeable than the other psychic types. They would not have knowledge of all the pleasures in the way that the others lacked. And so their testimony would not be uniquely privileged in deciding which life is most pleasant. That would undermine the argument. A second problem with Socrates' first argument here is that in the same way that the philosopher dabbles in the pleasures of appetite and in the pleasures of spirit, so do the other psychic types dabble in philosophy. Plato even mentions so himself here. Socrates describes the life of somebody who's ruled by appetite as follows. They live from day to day, gratifying the appetite of the moment. Sometimes they drink heavily while listening to the flute, while at others drinking only water and being on a diet. Sometimes they go in for physical training, while there are others when they are idle and neglect everything. Sometimes they spend their time engaged in what they take to be philosophy. What they take to be philosophy. Maybe not the real thing, but they're dabbling, in other words. We might ask, why is the philosopher's dabbling in the pleasures of appetite or spirit more authoritative than the appetitively sold person's dabbling in the pleasures of reason and in the pleasures of philosophy? Why is it that when the philosopher dabbles a little bit in the pleasures of fame or in the pleasures of partying, they automatically know what it's all about, whereas when the gourmand or when the celebrity tries out philosophy, they don't really get it at all. You have to spend your whole life doing that. Socrates' second argument for claiming that the contemplative life is most pleasant is very similar to the first, and it occurs at 582d. Socrates writes, "Moreover, the tool that should be used to judge is not the tool of the profit lover or the honor lover, but of the philosopher. Surely we said that judgment should be made by means of arguments. If the things being judged were best judged by means of wealth and profit, the praise and criticism of the profit lover would be closest to the truth. And if the things being judged were best judged by honor, victory, and courage, then praise and criticism of the honor lover and victory lover would be closest to the truth. But since it is by means of experience, knowledge, and argument, says Socrates, the praise of the philosopher and argument lover must be closest to the truth." What is Socrates saying here? He's saying that the contemplative life has the best arguments in its favor. If you were to ask the billionaire what's so great about being rich, or the partier about what's so great about partying hard all the time, you'll get one set of arguments. And if you ask the celebrity what's so great about being famous, why is it so pleasant, you'll get another set of arguments. And if you ask the contemplative, rationally sold philosophic types what the best arguments for their life is, you'll get a third set of arguments. Socrates is claiming that when you put those arguments side to side, the best arguments will be the arguments that are made by the contemplative types, the people who are ruled by the rational part of their soul, who enjoy contemplation more than anything else. They're going to have the best arguments. Since they have the best arguments, you go with their opinion, and their opinion says the contemplative life is the most pleasant, so that's what you should believe, that the contemplative life is the most pleasant. It basically goes as follows. Of the three lives, the contemplative life has the best arguments for being the most pleasant one. If the contemplative life has the best arguments for being the most pleasant, then the contemplative life is the most pleasant. So, the contemplative life is the most pleasant. What might be wrong with this line of reasoning? I think this is what it is. Normally, we do trust the strongest arguments, but there are a couple of circumstances in which we don't. One is if we haven't had a chance to hear the other arguments. If the strongest arguments we've heard are the strongest because they're the only arguments we've heard, that undermines the evidentiary point that they're the strongest arguments. Another time we might doubt the importance of an argument's strength is if its strength is not reliably tied to the truth of its conclusion. Let's focus on that with the very example that we're talking about. Let's ask why the contemplative life would have the best arguments for being the most pleasant. Why would it have them? Is it because it actually is the most pleasant? Or is it because, by way of living it, the people who live the contemplative life acquire the best abilities when it comes to arguing? If it's the second, then the quality of the arguments might not be as much of a reason to accept them. It could be that when you ask the millionaire to describe what's so great about being rich, and you ask the philosopher about what's so great to understand things, you'll get a much more rich and insightful and ponderous answer from the philosopher. And that's because they do that sort of thing all the time. That's their thing. You won't get nearly as articulate of an answer from the billionaire who does not spend all of their time doing that. But does that automatically mean that being a billionaire isn't as pleasant as being an intellectual? Plato is suggesting that it does mean that, and we might doubt that. Well now, that makes two in a row, and that's what Socrates says too. Look, well then, that makes two in a row. And at this point, Socrates is doing a little drum roll, and he's saying, and the next one, it's such a good argument, we're gonna toast to Zeus when we deliver it. Here goes! Observe then that the other pleasures, apart from that of the knowledgeable person, are neither entirely true nor pure. This is what the argument will hinge on. The pleasures associated with the rational part of the soul are true, in some yet to be specified sense, in a way that the other ones are not. We need to find out what it is for a pleasure to be truer. Let's see what they say. First, by way of example, such as with the example of being sick and then being healthy, Socrates points out that with some pleasures and pains, they cannot be sharply distinguished from one another. That you can't always tell whether you're in a state of bodily pleasure or just the absence of bodily pain. Likewise, it's hard to tell whether you're in a state of bodily pain or that's just an absence of bodily pleasure. You could consider a couple of examples. When you're sick for a very, very long time, or you have a painful injury that you're suffering from for a long time, when that pain goes away, it feels so good. It feels good. It's like pleasure. But it's not really pleasure, it's the absence of pain. They're not easy to distinguish. They bleed into each other. They blur. Or suppose that you're enjoying a really delicious meal, and you're really, really enjoying it, and you're really into how great it tastes, and then someone takes it away from you. You're mad, right? You're upset, right? And it feels like a pain. It feels bad. But is it a pain? Not really. It's more the cessation of the pleasant thing. But these are examples. In order for this to really be worthy of a toast to Zeus, we need something more than examples. We need a good old definition. And we get one. At 585a, Socrates says, think of it this way then. Aren't hunger, thirst, and the like some sort of emptiness related to the state of the body? And isn't foolishness and lack of knowledge, in turn, some sort of emptiness related to the state of the soul? Aren't people filled when they take in nourishment or gain understanding? And then, does the truer filling belong to what is less or to what is more? So here we found a clue to what being a truer pleasure might amount to. We have a theory of what desire and with it pleasure are. Socrates is saying that to have a desire is to have an emptiness, some kind of lack. That's what it is to want something. That's what desires are. And since pleasure is the satisfaction of a desire, we get the consequence that pleasure is the filling of said emptiness. So we get a little theory that a desire is an emptiness, and pleasure is the filling of such an emptiness. That might sound a little odd, but to be fair, in ordinary English, when we find something very pleasant, we will say that it is fulfilling. Socrates continues, which of the two types partakes more of pure being? The sorts belonging to bread, drink, relishes, and nourishment? Or the kind belonging to true belief, knowledge, understanding, and to all of virtue? I read that, and I'm not sure how to judge it. Oh wait, Socrates says, judge it this way. What belongs to what is always the same, immortal and true, is itself of that sort, and comes to be in something of that sort. It is more, don't you think, than what belongs to what is never the same and mortal, is itself of that kind, and comes to be in something of that kind. Let's slow down for a second. To feel pleasure, according to Plato, is to fill an emptiness. And a true pleasure is a true filling of some kind. So let's think about the two ways in which something can go wrong in a filling. Here's one way, is if the container being filled does not remain a suitable container. If it becomes leaky or dissipates or disintegrates, that's one way for filling to go awry. What's the other way for there to be a failure in filling? It's for the stuff that you're putting in the container to no longer be able to fill it. Maybe it evaporates. Maybe it turns into something that the container can no longer hold. Those are two ways for filling to go wrong, or two ways for a filling to be less true. Is if the container doesn't remain a suitable container, or the stuff that's being put into the container doesn't remain a suitable filling for it. So let's get technical for just a second and define this. We're going to say that X's filling up A is a truer filling than Y's filling up B, right? Where A and B are containers, and X and Y are fillings, and we're comparing X filling up A and Y filling up B, and we're saying, what would have to be true in order for X's filling up A to be the truer filling? What would have to be the case for X's filling up A to be the truer filling? We're going to say that as long as A remains a suitable container for X remains a suitable container for A, and either B doesn't remain a suitable container for Y, or Y doesn't remain a suitable filler for B. In other words, if there's a filling going on, and it's a truer filling than something else, it means that the container stays a suitable container, the filling stays a suitable filling, and one of those things isn't true of the other container. That's what we're saying. Now that we've got our definition, let's use some examples to fill in and clarify some more. To begin with, consider the body being filled with tacos. That's one kind of filling. It's an appetitive pleasure. First question, does the body remain a suitable taco container forever? No, unfortunately not. The body is mortal, the body decays, and alas, there comes a time in which the body cannot hold more tacos. The body does not remain a suitable taco container forever. What about tacos? Do they remain a suitable filler for the body? When you fill the body up with tacos, do you go, and they just stay in there forever? No, unfortunately not. They get digested, and then you gotta get rid of the results of the digestion. So, in that case too, not only does the body not remain a suitable container for tacos, tacos don't remain a suitable filler for the body. So we would say that this doesn't look like a very true filling in Plato's sense. You might try to stay full of tacos. You might want to hang on to that pleasure of being full of tacos, but no sooner than you fill up, then you empty, and you got to fill up again, then you empty, and you got to fill up, and you empty, and then there comes a point by which you can't keep filling up. Fleeting, transient. Compare that with, say, the pleasure of the soul being filled with understanding. First thing, does the soul ever cease to be a suitable container for knowledge? Here we gotta fill in an answer for Plato, answering on Plato's behalf due to arguments he makes elsewhere, including in the Republic elsewhere. Well, no, of course not. Plato has argued that the soul is immortal, or at least its rational part is immortal. It lasts forever, and far from becoming something that's no longer able to hold knowledge, Plato thought that actually the soul is better at knowing and understanding once it's freed of the body. So the soul does remain a suitable container for knowledge. What about knowledge? Does it remain a suitable filler for the soul forever? Far from being the thing that gets digested and then excreted and then you find a replacement, knowledge for Plato is something that once the soul's got it, as long as the body doesn't distract it or anything, it can hang on to it forever. So, with the souls being filled with knowledge, the container remains a suitable container, the filler remains a suitable filler, and that's a truer filling than the body being filled with tacos, where the body doesn't remain a suitable taco container, and the tacos don't remain a suitable body filler. So it looks like, if you're comparing appetitive pleasures with rational pleasures, where we're representing appetitive pleasures with taco eating, and we're representing rational pleasures with understanding stuff, the pleasures of understanding, the contemplative pleasures, the pleasures of the rational part of the soul, are truer. What about the spirited part of the soul? Oh yeah, let's talk about filling your social life with admirers, or filling your social life with praise, or filling your social life with followers or likes, or whatever you might want to call it. Plato called it honor. Filling your social life with that kind of social esteem, right? Is your social life, is that an everlasting thing that always remains a suitable container for praise and esteem? No, unfortunately not. For although your reputation might outlast you, you don't enjoy esteem with your reputation. You enjoy esteem with your social life. That's the thing that gets filled, whose filling constitutes social pleasure. And that thing, your social life, goes away when your body does. So it's not something that stays a suitable container for praise or a suitable container for honor. What about honor? Is it the kind of thing that remains a good filler for a social life? Maybe. That's actually a good question. For our purposes, and for Plato's purposes, it's not crucial to decide right now, for we have already settled that when it comes to the rational pleasures, we've got a constant container and a constant filler, and that fares better than any type of pleasure that involves an inconstant container or an inconstant filler. Since the spirited part of the soul at least has an inconstant container, your mortal social life, it doesn't fare as well. So we get the result that the rational pleasures are the truer pleasures. Wait a minute. Why does that matter? We've gotten so technical with our X's and Y's and our P's and Q's. How does this fit in argumentatively? What are we talking about again? The idea is this. You're mortal. You don't live forever. Well, not all of you does. Some of you rots away. It becomes the grass, as Mufasa explains in the Circle of Life speech. Your body dies away. And since your body dies away, your capacity to enjoy bodily pleasures dies away too. So if you want to devote yourself to some kind of pleasure, devoting yourself to bodily pleasure would be devoting yourself to pleasure that you can only enjoy a little bit of time. And even when you enjoy it while you're alive, it's so fleeting. You try to enjoy being filled up with tacos, but then the tacos don't fill you up completely anymore. So you try again, and again, and again. You fill up and empty, and fill up and empty. The cycle of repeating. You get what you want, and then you're bored, and then you don't, and then suddenly you want it again, and now you're in pain. The cycle of pain and boredom, which Buddhist philosophers, and also Schopenhauer frequently described, is being discussed here, as opposed to understanding something. If you really get something, you get it. You can hang on to that understanding, and it's always there for you to go back to and enjoy. And the part of you that enjoys that is immortal. So you can do that forever. If you devote yourself, if you devote your whole being to that type of activity, well, you have an eternity of joy, as opposed to, well, someone who lives for appetite. At this point, we are treading the territory of what Plato's view on the afterlife was, and it's actually rather interesting. You can find a lot of it in the Phaedo as well as in scant bits at the end of the Republic like this one. Plato was a Pythagorean, and as a Pythagorean, he believed in reincarnation. He believed that souls move from one body to the next in between lives, but there was an additional bit of philosophy that he added to this story. Your soul, while it was alive in a body, would learn to enjoy certain things. And based on what it learned to enjoy, that would largely determine where that soul went after death. So, if your soul went into the body of a cow, and you really, really got to enjoy the pleasures of eating, you will most likely, though not necessarily, most likely end up in the body of another beast that enjoys eating. Because once that cow dies, the soul pops up, and it says, where do I go now? Well, I really enjoyed the eating. Where can I find that? Oh, there's a cow being born. Zip. Right? Or, if you were someone who enjoyed social pleasures, socializing, your soul, once it's disembodied, is going to look around for where the social action's at. And you may end up reincarnated as a social animal. Maybe a human, maybe a wolf, maybe a bee, maybe an ant, but one of these types of creatures that lives in colonies and groups. But what if the thing that you loved the most was the truth and true theories and the structure of things? Well, in that case, according to Plato, when your soul popped out of the body and became disembodied upon death, it would seek out those immortal things it enjoyed contemplating. It would seek out the truths, the forms. And if during your life you studied them well enough, your soul just might get there, right? There's a sense in which, for Socrates, philosophy is the cartography of the neither world, right? By studying it a whole lot, your soul has a chance to dwell amongst immortal things forever. Whoa, we are digressing. Let's get back to our study guide questions and this lesson, hey? The crux of the argument is that the pleasures of the soul's rational part are immortal and everlasting, and as such, they're better pleasures. Formally speaking, the argument goes like this. First, the pleasures of the soul's rational part are truest. And here we proceed with the knowledge of what truest means. Second, if the pleasures of the soul's rational part are truest, then the contemplative life is the most pleasant. So, and third, the contemplative life is the most pleasant. That's the third argument for the claim that the contemplative life is the most pleasant of the three lives. It's the metaphysical argument, the one that appeals to the soul's immortality and gives a theory about filling up things. And in the text, if you take a look, Socrates describes the soul as a leak-proof vessel. There it is. Unlike the body, which is a disgusting, leaky vessel that you have to keep putting more stuff into with effort in order to just keep it along at some kind of pleasant status, the soul is a leak-proof vessel. It can hold knowledge for eternity. You get the idea. So what might be wrong with this argument? Well, there are a few things. One of them is, of course, that this argument assumes the immortality of a soul. If you're trying to convince someone how to live or what they should devote their life to, it's a little odd to start out by saying, okay, we both agree that the soul is immortal, right? So, right. That's a huge argumentative burden to carry. So there's one objection, is it assumes the immortality of the soul. Although, it's good to note at this point that there are contemporary versions of this argument. Haven't you ever heard someone say that you've got this hole in you that only God can fill, or only Jesus can fill, or only, the divine can fill, and that because of considerations involving your afterlife, you should actually now turn your whole life towards that God? That is not just something that came out of nowhere, and it wasn't made up last year or even last century. This is a legacy that goes back to Platonism. In addition to assuming the immortality of the soul, the argument also assumes this odd metaphorical theory about pleasure, that desires are emptinesses, and that pleasure is the filling of them. We don't have to accept that. Why should we think that a desire is an emptiness? Why not think that a desire is a little animal, and that when you satisfy the desire, you pet it? Or maybe desires are machines, and that when you satisfy them, you turn them on and work on them. Or maybe desires are songs, and when you satisfy them, you harmonize with them. There are a lot of different theories you could go with. Why do we have to accept the emptiness one? At least if you said that desires are little animals, you would have an account of the way, or of how it's possible for desires to become more sophisticated as they get fed more. How it's possible for someone's appetite to involve refined tastes after they feed it for a while. That's something that just saying appetite as a whole doesn't really accomplish. So, objection number one, this argument assumes the immortality of the soul. Objection number two, it problematically assumes that desires are emptinesses when there are other metaphors available and those ones might be better. Here's a third problem. The argument assumes that the rational pleasures are the best because they are the longest lasting. They last forever, just like the rational part of your soul does. On those grounds, we're supposed to think that the pleasure is better. But the duration of a pleasure, how long it lasts, is only one aspect of a pleasure. In addition to a pleasure's duration, there's also a pleasure's intensity. What if the pleasure of reason was infinite in its duration, it lasted forever, but its intensity was very, very low. It was just a mild pleasure. Well, a mild pleasure which lasts forever might not outweigh, ultimately, an intense pleasure that's only the length of a life. Once we take intensity into account, the conclusion that the rational life is the most pleasant one doesn't seem to automatically follow, even if we grant that it's the truest. For in addition to duration, there's also intensity to consider. Another objection, which we can get from Aristotle, is this. Does this theory assert that pleasure is the process of filling? The process of filling up, which involves stages and change? Or is pleasure the state of being full? The unchanging static state of being full? Right? We have this theory that desires are emptinesses, and correspondingly that pleasure is the filling of a desire, but it doesn't settle whether the pleasure is the process of filling or the pleasure is the state of being full. And this is a dilemma because either answer is going to pose an odd problem. It's not just a could you fill this in sort of question. Suppose that pleasure is the filling. If that were true, then for your soul to engage in the rational pleasures forever, your soul would have to be continually filling with knowledge, learning more and more. But what would that be? Learning forever? That doesn't make a lot of sense. Learning forever. I mean, in principle, you could learn that 1 plus 1 is 2, and then learn that 1 plus 2 is 3, and then learn that 1 plus 3 is 4, and you could learn as many things as there are integers, but let's face it, that doesn't seem to be very satisfying over the course of an eternity. How is it possible to engage in learning new, even more profound things always forever? That's what would have to be the case for the pleasure of the rational part of the soul to be immortal, which is what Plato is arguing. Weird, doesn't make a lot of sense. Well, suppose that instead pleasure was the state of being full, so that the pleasure of the rational part of the soul was not learning more and more and more and more. The pleasure was just thinking about what you know, just grasping it, just holding it in your mind, the way that you might savor a morsel by holding it in your mouth, right? You just think about that profound connection or whatever it is you're thinking of, and you just hold it. And the state, the unchanging state of being full, that's the pleasure. What's wrong with that option? If that were the case, then an eternity of pleasure of the rational part of the soul sounds like a changeless eternity. An eternity of just holding the truth in your mind. Ta-da! Forever. Just forever. When St. Thomas Aquinas described the beatific vision, which is the sophisticated Aristotelian version of heaven, he described being directly in God's presence, and so that in God's presence there would be a perfect harmonious connection between you and the divine, in which there's no more to learn, no more to discover, no more to unlock, no more distance to cross, perfect, intimate, apotheosis-like communion. Forever. Is that paradise or is it a nightmare? It's a changeless, eternal... It's like being a number or something, right? Like the number 2 is just there forever, right? Nothing happens to the number 2. That's what the best eternal life is supposed to be. We might balk at that. I think in real life, Plato is going to take the second horn of this dilemma, and Plato will indeed think that the best life of the soul is going to be a changeless one. So where do we end up? We began with the effort to show that the life of contemplation, the life of being ruled by the soul's rational part, is the most pleasurable kind of life. We had an argument which said that the rationally souled people have tried everything, so we should trust them when they say go with the contemplative life. But we doubt whether the way in which they try everything is enough to really know what they're talking about. And then we pointed out that the best argumentative testimony says that the contemplative life is the most pleasant, but all that argumentative testimony gets to be so good because it is honed by the skills of the people who are living the contemplative lives. And finally, we got this metaphysical theory that says that if you consider what pleasure is and what a state of the soul being pleased is, then scientifically, in a way, an analysis of pleasure yields that the soul will be more pleased for more of the time if it's structured to enjoy contemplation. That one has a few doubts to undermine it, too. So what do you think? Have you been convinced by Plato's argument of why being an honest and a fair person ultimately affects your happiness? That by being an honest and a fair person, you have the peace of mind to truly engage in life's best pleasure, which, if you do, you can engage in forever. Are you convinced by that line of reasoning? Do you think that you should be an honest and a fair person for some other reason? Do you deny that you should be an honest and a fair person? This is an ethics class. In any case, thank you very much for watching, and stay tuned for next video. Goodbye!